Hey guys! This is part 4 of What If Naruto Became Hidan. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 13. First task, don't do anything Emi wouldn't do. Considering this was his first time being held captive outside of a few traumatic training simulations with Hidan sensei, Naruto counted himself wholeheartedly unimpressed with his team's current incarceration. And not for the reasons most would think. At the very top of his now very long list of criticisms was the knowledge that he and his teammates had been conscious for a whole 7.392 minutes now, and in that time no one had checked in on them. Sure, that overly large screen mounted on the wall to their left may have been a one-sided mirror window of sorts, but did that give their captors, whoever they were, the right to be lazy and not inspect the situation in person for themselves? No. No, it most certainly did not, which led to a rapidly disappointing conclusion on Nanashi's part. That team kick-ass snatchers, all 5 of them if his memory served correct, were amateurs. They were incompetent, blundering, maladroit amateurs, and it wasn't just their decision to leave their captives alone long enough to plan an escape that brought Naruto to such a conclusion. The next of the numerous mistakes Naruto had come to identify in those essential 7.392 minutes was their choice of location. Not only had these people kept Emi and Yukio in the same room as Naruto, but the room they'd chosen to hold them in, while spacious and obviously underground, was also host to a variety of potentially dangerous features, like the 3 unnecessary wooden chairs Naruto and his teammates were currently positioned on, easily broken and turned into weapons, or the table in the far corner, also a source of potential stakes and/or blunt projectiles. And Naruto didn't even want to start getting into how much stupid it took to leave their confiscated weapon pouches on top of that aforementioned table, both in the same room as 3 very unhappy kidnappees and in clear view to boot. Yet another very damning, and no doubt fatal, mistake on the parts of their detainers though was their incarceration methods. Naruto wasn't much of an expert, being a green genin, and all but a few too many carefully tailored games with Hidan sensei had in vivid detail taught him the weakness of a watered-down bowline knot, or just about any knot as it were. Worse yet though, Naruto had long since noted that each of their hands were bound together behind their backs, and thus critically out of their captor's line of sight, while the rope they'd used was the cheap, hemp-wire kind. Add on the very notable fact that not one member of Team Kick-Ass was actually tied to their easily broken chairs or otherwise inhibited beyond the lack of overt arm movement, and these morons had a recipe for disaster on their hands. One sharp tug in the wrong direction would see Naruto free of his bonds and in a position to either break the chair he was currently sitting on for a fast makeshift weapon or risk a quick dash across the room towards his clearly seen tanto resting atop his and his teammates' kunai holsters. And that was only if Emi or Yukio didn't get similar ideas ahead of time and kickstart the madness before he had the chance to. Because, as dense as that particular idiot could be at times, Yukio had suffered through the very same training exercises as Naruto, and Emi wasn't fazed by much of anything these days either, which inevitably led to the biggest mistake yet. These poor ignorant a-holes had kidnapped the only genin team in the elemental nations to have survived months of literal hell under the tyrannical teachings of the complete and utter monster that was Hidan. After that, no matter what half-assed scare tactics these bastards tried to pull, these losers were nothing in comparison to Hidan after a bad night's sleep. Nothing. Which is probably why not even the overly emotional Yukio so much as twitched when the cast-iron behemoth of a door situated towards the opposite side of the room swung open with an echoing slam. Of the 5 men who then proceeded to file into the chilly lair, the first to catch Nanashi's attention was the obvious leader. Broad-shouldered with dark skin and dirty blonde hair cut short, he wore no distinctive clothing to hint at his origins. Only his more exotic features and the surprisingly intricate katana strapped to his back hinted at his profession, and or where his loyalties may lie. Most natives of Kumogakure were easy to spot due to that kind of unique coloring and arrogance, or so Hidan sensei said. Oh good, you're all up. I'm sure yo. It was probably very telling that Naruto was quick to tune out whatever scripted monologue the apparent leader had so obviously prepared in advance. Instead, he focused his time and energy on deciding on an appropriate nickname for the man. Moron number 1 had a nice ring to it. That resolved, Naruto looked up just in time to witness their chief captor all but flounce further into their makeshift prison with a bounce in his stride, his assorted minions dutifully trailing along from a safe distance behind him. Now able to see the rest of their captors after they'd finished sufficiently spreading out along the adjacent wall, Naruto was quick to note that some were as obviously dark-skinned, and from Cloud, as their leader, while the last 2 had only blonde hair and their choice of company to betray their birthplace. The last man to enter was also left to carry a moderate-sized ominous black bag, though Nanisher refused to ponder on the minor detail. He was instead far too busy coming to terms with yet another rookie mistake on their captor's part. Mistake number 17. The kidnappers had foregone their masks. By this point Nanisher had to bite back a put-upon sigh, not even bothering to consciously tally the various painful ways that stupid decision could be used against these fools when he and his teammates finally decided to leave. Reflex estimates put the number of contingency plans in the low 30s, and only if Nanisher and Yukio made sure Emi didn't get too inventive either. Just how did these manage to blindside us again? That makes this a whole lot easier. Moron number 1 was still blathering on, a measured step forwards and an overdramatic crack of his knuckles at separate points towards the end of his rant, only further indicating the staged nature of their entrance. A part of Nanisher didn't quite believe these people could be that inept as to need an actual script, while another just didn't care. That same section of his mind was instead plotting out the most opportune methods to most effectively express his overall displeasure once Team Kick-Ass inevitably stuck out. It was in light of all this knowledge that Nanisher wasn't even slightly disapproving when Yukio broke their collective silence to play along with their captor's game and asked the big question no doubt plaguing all of their minds. Nanisher wasn't really listening to Sano's words though, but carefully watching their only female teammate instead. And just who the fuck are you titbags supposed to be? The dark-haired boy sneered at their captors in obvious contempt, and there it was. Innocent doe eyes narrowed into slits and then her left foot tapped. Once, twice. Before finally, mouth pulled down into a brief grimace, Emi seemingly settled down once more to patiently await an answer to Yukio's question. Nanisher didn't see these seemingly nervous movements like their captors no doubt did though. Instead all he managed to read was, facial shift, bodily movement, facial shift. And there it was again. Exactly 4 seconds later. Right shoulder roll. Left shoulder roll. A twitch of the nose, chocolate eyes impatiently flicker from left to right, and then the edges of Emi's mouth spasmed for but a moment, and then the girl's movements froze once again. Bodily movement, facial shift, 7. P7. Plan 7. Okay, I can work with that. Ha! One of the bulkier men, moron number 3 in the lineup, snorted, completely oblivious to the devious plots Team Kick-Ass had so effectively communicated right under their noses. It appeared all that time spent hiding under the Yukage's desk making contingency plan upon contingency plan for situations such as these had actually paid off. Emi was admittedly rather intelligent to consider and implement such subtle and less than subtle strategies ahead of time in the event that this sort of situation occurred. Or worse, because as much as Nanisher utterly loathed to admit it, Emi had been correct in her assumption that they need every advantage they could get should they be unlucky enough to be at ground zero on the day Hidan-sensei finally snapped. It was unfortunately a distinct possibility in the future, particularly given their line of work and what they'd witnessed of their senseis so far. Mouthy little brat, aren't you? Number 3 eventually jeered in malicious mirth, moron number 5 snickering from the end of the lineup at the cliché comment. The sound effectively brought Nanashi's attention back to the present. Just answer the question already, shit-stain. Yukio grumbled up at the man, completely unperturbed by number 3's poor attempt at intimidation. And for once, Nanisher understood Sano's perspective completely. Like any of these amateurs could possibly compare to a round or 10 of Dagger the Little Shit to death, especially with Hidan-sensei all too happily claiming that he was it. Yukio. Emi mumbled under her breath, nudging their teammate gently in the shoulder from her position at Yukio's far right. She was interrupted, however, before she could continue her near-silent pleading. Read, playing the role. Moron number 1 murmured, not even turning when he next called out to his subordinates, T. Yuri! I want you to take that one and teach him a bit of a lesson on manners. Sure thing, boss. Moron number 4 nodded in agreement, appearing focused and efficient as he stepped forward to get started on his latest objective. With pleasure. Moron number 3 cheered louder than his soon-to-be partner in torture, a cruel smile twisting at his puckered lips. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Yukio howled when the pair easily hefted the 12-year-old boy up off his seat only to start bodily dragging his struggling form to the door. Put me down! Put me down and let me go now or I swear I'll slam. Peace and quiet. Moron number 1 sighed happily, having never once removed his dark eyes from Nanisher and Emi's bound forms. Isn't it just so nice? Not feeling as chatty as your friend you two? That's quite alright. The chief idiot shrugged, never once questioning the subtle shift of Nanashi's posture, the near-constant twitching of Emi's sniffling nose, or the nervous tapping of either of their feet. 3. We'll get to that later. Moron number 1 assured the both of them with a false sincerity either of the bound genin paid too much attention to. But on the off chance one or both of you are feeling cooperative, would you mind answering a few questions? We'd like to know a little more about that sensei of yours, you see. And for a moment Emmy faltered and Nanisher felt a spark of concern before. 2. Just some harmless bits and pieces of information you do realize. Nothing all that detrimental to his continued health. 1. Your silence could be detrimental, however, to both of you and your friend. What? No volunteers. Oh dear, mistake number 29. The kidnappers had given them far too many opportunities to act. Game time was over. I suppose this isn't going to be as peaceful as I'd hoped it would be. Go, line break. These guys really sucked at the whole intimidation thing, Yukio finally decided amidst yet another wave of venomous verbal abuse. Since being dragged across the underground hallway just outside the main room into this glorified broom closet, the Tide Genin had been near mindlessly spouting every Hidan-grade threat and swear he could think of, and it was actually working. Within a few minutes of the onslaught, T and Yuri, whichever one was which, had taken to stand rigidly by the door, both of them staring at little Yukio in unadulterated horror. At first it had been a bit perturbing, but Yukio nonetheless pushed on and made a profound effort to make sure the twisted scenarios he painted never slowed. It sure beat the hell out of being tortured, so why stop when he had such a good thing going? And these two had been planning on torturing him, of this Yukio had little doubt. Still clutched all but forgotten in the shorter one's hands, those pliers were a clear indication of such. Which meant, in Yukio's humble opinion at least, that these two were just another pair of pussies. Here Yukio was, an inexperienced genin to all accounts and a tied-up one at that, and these idiots were too scared of his bravado to get close enough to do him any real physical damage. It was almost like these idiots were a bunch of rookies themselves. I'll tear your motherfucking balls off with my teeth and feed them to you. But then again, judging these guys, or pretty much everyone else, based almost solely on Hidan's hefty standards probably wasn't very fair, or healthy of him, now that Yukio thought about it either. So maybe, ND murder your bleeding nephews in their sleep, you bastards. I'll especially enjoy RA. Maybe he should cut them a little bit of slack. Because, even as desensitized as Yukio suspected he and his teammates had become to their sensei's various quirks over the last few months, some of the things he'd been spouting in recent minutes were sick and twisted and repeated almost word for word as they'd originally come out of Hidan's mouth. And that was a lot of stress to just dump on someone, especially a pair of underprepared kidnappers. Of this Yukio was very sure. To peel your brother-in-law's dick like a banana and feed it to his sister while Should we try to stop him again? Yukio heard the shorter blonde one, usually all work and no play he deduced, whisper to his compatriot. I don't really know. The larger of his captors mumbled in reply. This one dark-skinned and bulging with a shock of red hair only a few shades darker than Inashi's. He no longer acted the part of the cocky sadistic badass he tried to portray himself as earlier in the larger room while still amidst his boss and fellow minions. Talk about bluffing your way through the job. I'll their grandparents watch me and then your dog too. And maybe Yukio was getting a bit carried away by this point, but ND inserted in your fucking urethra while a reindeer STA. What does that even mean? The big one mumbled with a disturbed look on his face. Seeing this, Yukio ruthlessly dismissed his worries in favor of feeling distinctly pleased with his progress. Even if the reindeer thing might have been a tad bit overdone, Hidan hadn't revealed if such a scenario was even humanly possible, let alone ethical. For the victim or the reindeer in question no one knew, so maybe Yukio shouldn't have used that one just quite yet? It could piss on it for all I care, you lousy pieces of shit infies. I really don't know. The shorter man murmured in reply to his distraught comrade. Andy, then I'll. And for the first time in nearly 14 straight minutes Yukio faltered. He was running out of material and he couldn't quite remember. What had Hidan said he needed to do now? Remember what Sensei said, Yukio chanted to himself. First you give verbal hell and then. I'm sorry, Yukio suddenly smiled all too sweetly up at the pair, watching carefully from behind wide dark eyes as both T and Yuri spluttered at his sudden shift of mood. Did one of you guys say something? And then you give them some psychological hell. So while they're still trying to figure you out, all you have to do is. One sharp jerk of his elbows and Yukio could only grit his teeth as he valiantly fought through the momentary pain of rope burn. There was then an instant of awkward silence soon broken by the cracking snap of his bonds, and in that instant Yukio was free, and as planned, neither T nor Yuri seemed to be in any position to compute that fact either, for the next few seconds or so at least. Which meant Yukio had to move fast, faster than he ever had before. All you have to do is Springing from his seat, Yukio leapt across the room towards his greatest threat at the present moment, the physically larger of his two would-be interrogators. Using his smaller size to his advantage, Yukio speedily slipped inside the perplexed idiot's guard to deliver a devastatingly sharp blow to the big redhead's solar plexus. While the bulging shinobi choked on the very air he breathed, his slighter no-nonsense partner was only just now turning his head to catch sight of what was happening. Luckily, Yukio's free hand was already half-forming the hand seals needed. The words body flicker technique, Shunshin no Jutsu, left his lips in a quiet mumble, and, a swift surge of chakra through his reedy limbs later, Yukio was on the move again. Jab, jab, punch, and the second shinobi was down with a final sweeping slide of Yukio's leg, twisting his body up into a crouched position on the floor. Yukio only just managed to dodge an oncoming blow from behind. No longer stunned, the big man was now on the offensive. Seeing the shorter one starting to sit upright from the corner of his eye too, Yukio knew he had to finish this. The room they were in was sadly far too small to start throwing some much-beloved fire jutsu around, however, and, depending on how Emi and the bastard were going, such a move, even if it didn't kill Yukio in the process too, might attract the wrong kind of attention from the outside anyway. The last thing Yukio wanted or needed was more bad guys showing up. Then again, if he couldn't use his go-to element, maybe, Earth Release, Devouring Earth, Doton Tabe Chikyu, a surge of chakra, and immediately, the concrete floor beneath them all gave a mighty shudder and everyone and everything in the tiny room seemed to freeze for a moment. And then, shit, nothing else was happening. There were no cracks or blemishes in the floor, no further overt movement. Nothing. Nada. Diddly fucking squat is what Yukio got. Shit. Crap. Fuck ity fuck. Meeting the now narrowed gazes of T and Yuri from across the room as they began to inch closer and closer, Yukio grit his teeth and silently seethed at his terrible turn of luck. Hidan had managed to only briefly describe elemental manipulation and help identify their individual affinities a few weeks ago now, so while nowhere near close to mastering his most beloved affinity for fire and too limited in his offensive jutsu arsenal to improvise anything else properly, Yukio could immediately see what his sensei had meant when he mentioned how very noticeable a difference there was between elements you knew how to use and the ones you really didn't. And having realized what T and Yuri already had, that the jutsu had failed, Yukio quickly ran through the seals again just as the larger of his attackers decided to strike and move forward until he was just outside reaching distance. The smaller one stayed back but had annoyingly enough drawn a kunai in one hand and those damned pliers were clutched in the other. He was obviously prepared to jump in again if his bulging friend didn't finish the job, knowing he couldn't afford to take a hit and give these idiots any more of an advantage than they already had. Yukio gathered every last scrap of chakra he could think to spare. For this jutsu to work, he didn't have superior chakra control or a talent for sealing like Emi or the advantage of a secondary affinity to fall back on as Nanisher had. All Yukio had going for him right now was adrenaline and a 0.2-second window before the biggest idiot's fist connected a no-doubt debilitating blow to his face. As such, the genin boy from Hot Water needed to somehow bludgeon his way through the unfamiliar technique Emi had tried seemingly in vain to teach him in their last week on the road, and he needed to do it now. Earth Release, Devouring Earth, Doton Tabe Chikyu. Yukio cried for the second time, putting everything he had into the technique just as one of the big man's bulging hands managed a glancing blow to his shoulder, and the effects were immediate. The concrete floor beneath them all gave yet another violent shudder, and then finally, his chakra flowing down into the earth through his feet, Yukio watched as the ground before him quite literally opened up like the jaws of some gargantuan animal. Even the surrounding walls seemed to buckle with the emergence of the floor's earthen teeth. T and Yuri, unprepared for the sudden lack of a solid surface beneath their feet, immediately disappeared from view only to land at the bottom of the fissure below with a resounding crash. Yukio himself thankfully remained right where he had been, still standing upright at the far end of the room, backed up against a now fractured wall with a gaping crevice that took up the near entirety of what was previously the floor situated before him. Staring almost numbly at the hole for what felt like a moment too long, Yukio managed to snap himself out of his shock long enough to cut off whatever remained of his chakra from the jutsu. Immediately the artificial crevice began to cave in on itself with an echoing boom and a series of sickening crunches to follow. Too much time spent around Hidan had taught Yukio that those last echoing sounds were the breaking of some very important bones. Indeed, it seemed that without chakra to actively manipulate and support the earthen jaws, the entire structure was left to the mercy of gravity, with T and Yuri both still trapped inside it. Sensei said that all you have to do is hit them where it hurts. Yukio finally finished with a shallow panting sigh of relief, his shoulders sagging at the sudden respite. Still staring down at the now bulging mound of rubble left in the aftermath of his half-botched technique though, Yukio felt a small smile tugging at the edges of his lips. "Good night, whoever you were," the dark-haired genin sang out just that little bit louder, his smile widening even further across his face. And why? Because he'd done it. He'd really actually done it. Now all he had to do was find Emmy and the bastard and get the hell out of here so they could dash. Arg, there's one still conscious down there? For a full minute Yukio considered his options. If at least one of his attackers was conscious, then that meant there was a good chance one or both would survive, something Yukio felt torn about, because while he was a shinobi and understood he was expected to kill, a part of Yukio was actually quite relieved to know he hadn't descended quite that far down the rabbit hole yet. The more practical section of his mind meanwhile just wanted T and Yuri out for the count so he wouldn't have to worry about a counterattack or the appearance of reinforcements later on. Thankfully, this conclusion to events seemed to satisfy both of the genins' needs. While the would-be interrogator's shallow grave probably wasn't deep enough to hold them for long, and neither was the weight of the debris piled upon them enough to truly kill them, at the very least the various injuries they'd sustained should slow them down enough to inhibit any escape attempts in the meantime. It was a happy ending all the way around. And that meant Yukio could take a moment and relax, because he'd actually really done it. Now, Yukio suppressed what could have been a deranged giggle to declare even louder than before, his tone cheerful given his currently uninhibited victory high. "Where am I supposed to find a reindeer at this time of day?" He tried really hard not to take too much pleasure in the muffled whimper of sheer torment that followed. Failing to do so, however, Yukio was at least man enough to admit what he already knew to be true. That was way too much fun, he verbally concluded. He also knew he needed to stay well away from his sensei in the future, given just how abundantly clear it now was that he'd already spent far too much time with the man to be healthy. He'd have to discuss it with the rest of his team later. Until then, they had to meet up again, escape together, and then somehow get to the exams they no doubt already missed before Hidan-sensei found them and did unspeakable things to their corpses. Right. Time to go. Carefully dancing over the rather impressive mound of shattered concrete and soil left behind by his jutsu, and ignoring any noises any particular part of the pile may have made, Yukio made his way to the door and slipped out into the bland hallway from before. Immediately across from him was another metallic door which Yukio knew to be the room he and his team had originally woken up in. Glancing up and down the passageway to find the coast thankfully clear, the dark-haired boy dashed towards his target and, after turning the unlocked steel knob, took a quick peek inside. Yukio wasn't at all surprised by what he found within. Splatters of drying blood and blackened scorch marks were prevalent all over the room's various surfaces. The splintered wood of what was once a chair and what appeared to be a weaponized table leg lay discarded in some far-off corner, while the three remaining ex-captors lay sprawled amidst the chaos. One remained crumpled in a corner with thin ropes, formerly used to bind Yukio's teammates, carefully knotted around his torso and any other offending limbs. His left wrist looked to be sitting at a rather unnatural angle, and the black eye forming had already forced one eye shut. Another man, this one blonde and possibly a distant relation to the smaller man Yukio had left half buried next door, looked to have been somehow glued spread-eagled to the far wall. The sight of several intricate black squiggles around and under the shinobi's body with odd kanji carefully intertwined within the varying patterns screamed Fuinjutsu. That one had been a victim of Emi then. Speaking of Emi, Yukio finally spotted her near the room's lone blackened window along with their kidnapper's apparent leader. Unlike his minions though, the boss man was quite impressively conscious and, from the looks of it, really wishing he wasn't. The man in question, like the blonde pinned up on the wall, appeared to be stuck flat on his back to the floor like a fly caught in the spider's web. The seals holding him glowed every now and again when the boss man seemed to tense, trying to fight the seals and move, Yukio realized. Even without the seals though, Yukio doubted the man would be getting very far on his own. Not only was Emi sitting on the shinobi's chest while she whispered God only knows what sort of demented shit in the Pursad's ear, but a very familiar tanto was also quite deeply embedded in boss man's right kneecap. That's definitely the bastard's handiwork. The aforementioned bastard extraordinaire himself stood a few feet away from Emi's interrogation with his arms crossed over his chest, his slender form leaning casually against the wall behind him, while those expressionless green eyes lazily scanned the room over and over again for possible threats. His easy dismissal of Yukio still standing in the doorway should have been insulting, but Yukio had already found his attention caught by something else entirely. On the wall behind Nanushir, clearly written in what appeared to be blood, was the following line and code: TST. And suddenly it all made sense. Their kidnapping took place just outside the examination building they'd been told to meet at upon arrival in the village. The entire attack had also occurred in broad daylight and not even a few moments after their Jonin-sensei had arrived, to no doubt confirm their identities and presence there to begin said test. Then they were held in a room together with one of those mirror windows Yukio had heard about before. They'd been watched the entire time, the team's reactions no doubt studied and noted. And then of course there were guys kidnapping them. They weren't from Cloud at all. The transformation jutsu was a very versatile technique Yukio knew, and if these guys were somehow faking even their ethnicity to throw Team Kick-Ass of the scent then that meant that this was all a test, this was their exam, and in the time they'd been here, each and every member of Team Kick-Ass had escaped their bonds, beaten and bloodied the examiners, and if Emi's lack of focus on anything but the boss man she was sitting on and whispering to was anything to go by, it was probably safe to say that they'd also tormented and tortured those very same examiners too. Shit. Yukio immediately turned his attention back to Nanushir, who had yet to move throughout the dark-haired boy's startling epiphany, his mouth open to protest or demand an explanation even, before Nanushir jerked his head to the side, towards Emi, and narrowed those bow-green eyes meaningfully. The message initiated, Nanushir then proceeded to shift his weight accordingly and twitch some more. It took Yukio a moment to translate since he still didn't quite have the subtler version of their little codes and movements down pat like Emi or Nanushir had. He figured it out eventually though, just as he had the message written all over the wall. Bodily movement, facial shift, bodily movement, bodily movement, bodily movement. Or rather, on a normal day, Yukio would have considered Nanashi's message, his order, and then immediately told the condescending bastard where to shove it. On an ordinarily normal day, Yukio would have on principle done exactly the opposite of whatever the hell it was Nanushir wanted him to do. Today was not an ordinary day. Taking a few steps further into the room, though not before firmly and quietly shutting the door behind him, Yukio turned his attention to Emi, who was now waving a piece of sealing paper. Was that an explosive tag? In front of that poor boss man/examiner's transfigured face. He understood what he had to do now, what Emi and Nanushir had somehow and at some point in their time here put in motion. The job wasn't too hard, all things said and done, but Yukio wasn't quite sure what the results would be if Nanushir was right with the first coded message, and this was all a part of their first Chunin examination. There weren't a lot of ways to misinterpret Go in this context after all, and Yukio felt he'd figured it out well enough. Because to go was to continue, proceed and advance, and in this case, Geo meant play along or else. Okay then, I suppose you guys did well enough with yours then? Yukio finally spoke aloud, trying to pass off his previous lack of action as a fascination with his teammates' handiwork, which wasn't entirely untrue anyway. Yukio? Emi suddenly exclaimed, her head snapping up immediately once her attention was finally torn away from her, literally, captive audience. What took you so long? She asked curiously, her head tilted slightly to the side, and wasn't it terrifying that Yukio could instantly recognize the influence Hidan had had on all of them? Not only in terms of their general skills but also in their attitudes and mannerisms too? I ended up trying out that jutsu you taught me, Yukio replied casually despite his inner turmoil over the situation and his own observations. It was a lot harder than I thought it was gonna be is all. Don't worry about it now, he finished sheepishly with one hand raised to scratch the back of his neck, a hand he promptly dropped not a moment later after realizing exactly where that particular habit had originated from too. Alrighty then. Emi conceded with a sickly sweet smile, before looking back down at the trapped boss man below her, her previous expression sharpening to a terrifying degree as she did so. Sorry, but what were we supposed to be talking about again? Meanwhile the boss man's dark eyes were wide and pleading, his dark skin suspiciously pale with the strain he had put upon himself. It was actually impressive at all that the man managed to fight the seals holding him down just enough to slowly move his head back and forth in a negative motion. At this movement, however, Emi quite notably frowned down at the man in disappointment, practically pouting at his refusal. Yukio thought the expression might have been cute, if it weren't for that suspiciously familiar gleam in her chocolate brown eyes. Yeah, we have been spending way too much time with Hidan-sensei. Something about the 101 unconventional uses of explosive tags, I think. Nanushir finally spoke up and Yukio felt himself flinch in sympathy for the poor, unsuspecting examiner guy. The dark-haired boy didn't know where or when exactly Emi had come up that particular routine, but he remembered quite vividly the day she decided to run it by him. He still wasn't entirely sure Hidan wasn't behind it somehow, despite, formerly, sweet Emi's assurances to the contrary. Right, that it was. The girl in question happily cheered, thanks Nanushir. So as I was saying, Emi began again, and like Nanushir, Yukio decided he'd be better off finding a nice unbloodied spot in the room somewhere to sit down and wait. If their exam hadn't been interrupted yet, then they still had some objective or another to complete before they passed. Considering they'd all already escaped from their bonds and neutralized their opponents, the only thing left to do bar leave the complex entirely was gather information. To get the kind of information they most likely would have needed, however, while versatile, Emmy continued to listlessly prattle on, once again holding her explosive tag right up to the boss man's face whilst pointing out some such or other squiggle inked into the paper. The logistics of option 43 mean you need to take extra care when you insert the first tag into your victim's open wound. You might need to twist it just that little bit more to get the right angle. Once that's done, however, you can begin stage 3 of the technique and acti. Yeah, they were going to be here for a while. Chapter 14. With flying colors. I am so damn proud. At this utterance, Naruto let himself smile even in the physical world. Of course, he was only half paying attention to the Biju's almost tearful ramblings because, NB, she picked up the Fuinjutsu so fast, you'd think she was an Uzumaki. By this point, Naruto was also roughly 82% sure Kurama thought he couldn't hear its gushing commentary over his students' performances so far. The old fox had even gotten a bit teary-eyed towards the end of Emmy's patented options 8, 17 and 26, so considering how uncharacteristically emotional the Biju was acting, Naruto felt no shame in making cursory notes of only the excruciatingly embarrassing details for future blackmail usage and otherwise spent the rest of his energy on trying to ignore his resident semi-friendly tenant for the time being. Unfortunately, disregarding this particular one-sided conversation was easier said than done, and the little girlie had to go and get creative after she found that stupid list Naruto made when the idiot host couldn't sleep again. Kurama spluttered unhappily. I didn't realize she memorized it all though, and speaking of memorizing unfortunate things, hadn't that been an interesting day for everyone involved? Mind you, Naruto hadn't actually meant to make such a comprehensive list of morbid half-formed ideas and ramblings any more than he'd meant to just leave it lying about for just anyone, like Emmy, to find but, well, sleep deprivation had influenced Naruto into some pretty questionable situations in the last few months, and neither that particular list nor the results of it were the worst. Hell, the events of the night before were only a pale example of Naruto's propensity to not think his actions through when in that disturbed post-memory dream place. Though a part of Naruto still had to wonder if anyone would notice his little self-prescribed medicinal prank anytime soon. On an entirely unrelated note, those Hokage guys really needed to work on their security. Is that another explosive tag? The sudden exclamation effectively brought Naruto back to the present, an action the silver-haired Jonin found himself vaguely grateful for. Last night's dream and the implications that followed were still far too fresh in his mind, until he had a better understanding of the memories and her, or at least a better grip on his emotions. Naruto needed to keep himself distracted lest he sink back into that bad headspace. He really didn't need Kurama bitching at him again, so Naruto forcibly stopped thinking about the night before, about the pranks and the memories in her, and even turned his attention away from Kurama's semi-amusing inner monologue to instead focus on the pair of Leaf Chunin standing in front of him. Both young men were of course far too busy peering through the one-way window before them to pay Naruto any attention, especially seeing that neither Chunin had yet seen fit to change their position since the last time Naruto had bothered to acknowledge their existences, both of them still stupidly standing there with their backs oh so foolishly facing him. Naruto cracked another half-smile from under his stupid hat, this expression far more devious than the last. He of course made no move to act on any of the less than acceptable ideas currently forming. He was still too comfortable lounging in the nearby seating area where he'd been, in no uncertain terms, ordered to sit silently unless spoken to and wait. Sure, it had already been almost an hour since then now, but Naruto wasn't about to complain for once. Between listening to Kurama natter on, watching his genin fuck over the disguised examiners and fantasizing about the numerous ways he himself could mess with the hired help, Naruto was more than entertained, and better yet, distracted, just waiting here for the exam to end. What the heck is wrong with these kids? The first Chunin grumbled, and not for the first time either, his gray eyes never once leaving the scene playing out before him. Naruto only just barely managed to stifle a laugh at the question. And just how many times was this snotty little bastard going to ask that same question anyway? Because wanting to know what specifically went wrong with his kids was both understandable and decidedly not the question that needed asking. No, Naruto knew all too well it was rather the who in that equation that these Chunin and the rest of the world needed to worry about. Don't know. The second Chunin blurted in reply to his partner's earlier interjection, still looking lost and repeating himself just the same as he had every other time he'd been asked that very same query. Both young men had clipboards clutched uselessly in their hands, supposedly to make notes, or something Naruto guessed, but neither had written much of anything down after they'd had Bandana Boy dragged away into yet another room what felt like ages ago now. Having quickly realized he wouldn't be witnessing that part of the exam, Naruto was of course eventually assured that no permanent harm would come to Yukio. Naruto hadn't been worried. He still wasn't, after being informed of what was actually involved earlier that morning after having been tracked down by some such or other TNI-type shinobi. Naruto had been rather quick to realize that this particular exam tested information gathering and fortitude just as his own had in the original timeline. Konohagakure was just going about it in a different way this time. Instead of gathering up a bunch of kids and putting them through an impossibly hard written test only to reverse psychology them into cheating or whatever, Konoha had in this early period decided to put all the genin teams on the spot with an elaborate ruse and demand information from the traumatized kiddies. Of course, there wouldn't be any actual overt torture, beyond a few subtle genjutsu and a glancing blow to the head or two, or so Naruto had been told. The entire thing was focused more on the psychological than physical aspects of a mission, as seen when they separated Yukio from his teammates, and threatened his safety to get some seemingly desired, though innocuous, information out of Emi and or Nanisher. Depending on how long they held out, and how well they handled themselves in their given situations, each genin team would be awarded points that could lead to an advantage in the next exam. Having too few or no points would lead to disqualification. What none of the proctors or organizers seemed to have taken into account though was the distinct possibility that a team might somehow escape their confinement, and act according to the situation they believed to be very, very real. Redhead is really coming along with his lightning manipulation, even if Naruto can't use that particular element for shit. We'll need to find some real jutsu for Little Red soon. Ooh. And what about the part when that one meatbag lost teeth and then the look on that other one's face when girly bitch slapped him? By the sage, that was priceless. Kurama continued to prattle on near mindlessly with another roaring laugh. Do you think Sakazuki's even alive in there? The first Chunin asked after a few more minutes of staring almost dumbly at the scene playing out before them. Don't know. The second repeated. Again, still smiling a little bit too widely from behind the pair, Naruto momentarily considered catching their attention so as to suggest an end to the test before Sakazuki and anyone else still stuck in that room took any more unnecessary damage. A part of him wanted to say that he did this out of concern for the well-being of everyone in that room, but if there's one thing that hadn't changed about Naruto since his arrival in this era, it was his tendency towards brutal honesty, and he sure as hell wasn't about to start lying to himself now. The only legitimate reason he could think of for trying to end this little test here and now was the often fickle morals of Konoha's shinobi. He didn't want his team penalized for overreacting. Kurama would never shut up if he allowed such a travesty to occur. Opening his mouth to begin acting on his decision, Naruto was soundly interrupted by the soft click of the adjacent door before it swung open with a resounding bang. The man set to enter the room was tall with icy blue eyes and very blonde hair pulled up high into a ponytail. Naruto's immediate reaction to the new arrival was to shout, "Ino's dad? What the fuck?" Though he thankfully just barely managed to suppress this impulse before he could make too much of an ass out of himself. The sight of the man's green vest with its corresponding ornamental buttons on the shoulders only reinforced how very important Naruto's last-minute save was. The additional decoration on the flak jacket wasn't as prominent in the future, but Naruto still vaguely remembered one of Iruka-sensei's few marginally less boring lectures mentioning that such additions were indicative of a jonin rank before a mass uniform upgrade following the Second Shinobi War. Which meant that this man was a jonin, a much rarer rank amongst shinobi these days, as Naruto had also come to learn from his time amongst Yugakure's ranks after his own promotion. This however also meant that the new arrival was more than likely the head proctor of the exam. Or in other words, it was definitely a good thing Naruto had refrained from screaming the first thing that came to mind upon seeing the man. Because if this guy was running this particular exam, it also stood to reason he was affiliated with whatever intelligence department Konohagakure had managed to establish since its founding over a decade and a half ago, just like Ibiki and Enko had been during Naruto's first exam. The last thing he wanted or needed right now was to be on this guy's radar over suspicious reactions to his presence. "Yamanaka-san!" The second Chunin suddenly exclaimed, further confirming Naruto's suspicions. While whatever his first name was, Yamanaka closed the door behind him. Naruto noted that both of the Chunin had spun around to face their obvious superior at some point or another. What caught Naruto's attention, however, was how calm the first Chunin appeared next to his overly paranoid partner. Did that first guy know something the rest of them didn't, or how's this lot doing then? Yamanaka demanded of his subordinates, seemingly intent to ignore Naruto's presence in the room. And while a part of Naruto was content with the proctor's decision, another part, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Captain Yamato now that he thought about it, criticized the Yamanaka's cavalier dismissal of a possible threat, and Naruto could pose a very serious threat when he wanted to, regardless of his ability to summon Kurama or some of Mount Myoboku's giant toad warriors to help cause widespread havoc and mayhem if he so wished. Not that he'd actually put any, or at least all that much, thought into such a scenario. Promise. Well, they were acting according to predictions based on earlier surveillances. The second Chunin began his report. However, that was only until they subdued Sakazuki and his team about 30 minutes ago. Chunin 1 cut in. The seals Mitosama offered us seem to have held the transformations beyond the user's consciousness. We are as a result not yet sure if any of our agents is able enough to move, or if Chunin Fukao and Inuzuka's partner are still alive at all by this point. The statuses of both Chunin Inuzuka himself and Chunin Fujimoto are unknown. The genin reunited some 10 to 12 minutes ago with the girl employing some form of psychological torment on Sakazuki since previously overcoming our squad. He finally finished with a flourish, the hand not occupied with the Chunin's near blank clipboard gesturing quite animatedly towards the one-way window situated nearby. What? Yamanaka hissed after a long moment trying to analyze what he'd been told. Once the information had obviously sunken in, however, it wasn't a moment longer before the Jonin was ruthlessly rushing towards the window, shoving Chunins 1 and 2 aside as he went. NB, if you decrease the chakra fluctuations with an extra brush stroke here, you can minimize the blast radius. Emi was saying, still in position atop the torso of the man Naruto assumed to be Sakazuki. Nanushiro was leaning against the far wall, his emerald eyes staring blankly at the adjacent door, while Yukio lay sprawled on a cleaner patch of floor with one arm pillowing his head, his free hand frivolously tossing a kunai up and down, up and down. Both boys looked to be very bored, Naruto thought. Now, Emi continued all too cheerily, seemingly content to ignore the disinterest of her teammates in favor of tormenting her visibly terrified captive. That fits in with unconventional option number 76, which involves plucking your enemy's left eye from its socket, preferably with a kunai, and inserting the rolled-up explosive tag. If you've calibrated it right, which I'm sure we have right here, the blast won't even kill your victim right away. Isn't that just great? Arg. Sakazuki grunted helplessly in protest. You know, I think it's pretty spectacular, Emi. Yukio spoke up without ever pausing or looking up from his lackadaisical knife play. Can we try it? Nanushiro asked curiously from his corner, his tone still impressively impassive while his emerald gaze remained firmly locked on the door to guard against the appearance of further enemies. To this, Emi only looked over her shoulder to smile playfully at both of her disinterested teammates, and utter a playful, well, it was enough for Yamanaka at least. What the hell have you been teaching these kids? The Jonin immediately rounded back on Naruto with a growl of displeasure, his cheeks flushing with disgust and anger as he spoke. Naruto quite simply just couldn't resist. Leisurely, he assumed a distinctly thoughtful pose from his indolent seated position. One hand rested idly under his chin while the beginnings of a slow smile twitched at the very edges of his lips. You know, I'm not entirely sure, he told the disgruntled man, his tone of voice alight with faux confusion, while a benign smile began to peek out from underneath his thrice-be-damned fucking straw hat as he spoke. Option 76 originally involved 3 more explosive tags, a silver soup spoon and a potato. By this point I have no idea where she got the altered seal matrix from, though her suggestion should have similar results, as far as I can tell. Naruto finished with a shrug, not even bothering to hide the impressed lilt interwoven with his words, though he did manage to stifle the cackle of laughter that threatened to escape at Yamanaka's dumbfounded expression. The blank stares he received from both Chunins 1 and 2 alike were almost as good. What? You might want to get them out soon, Naruto continued carelessly with a nod towards the window, pointedly ignoring Yamanaka's befuddled query as he did so. Mr. Sakazuki and they probably won't stay conscious much longer. After that they'll move on to one of the others, provided my genin managed to wake them back up. I tap tap tap, and never again would Naruto mock Bandana Boy's sense of timing or humor. This was comic gold. Hey, anyone in there? Hello? The genin boy called out, waving at the window mirror with a too familiar pout etched upon his rounded youthful face. Have we passed yet? At this, Naruto couldn't resist the sudden urge to let his smile widen again, all sharp angles and teeth this time. So they'd figured it all out, huh? Probably not Yukio, of course. The boy was far too much like Naruto had been at that age, all flashy jutsu and action before the concept of subtlety even entered the equation. No, it was more likely Nanushiro or Emi, or both, to catch on, though Naruto found himself curious as to how they'd managed to communicate that fact to one another in addition to the ever-oblivious Yukio too. He and the Chunin duo had been watching the whole time. Had Naruto missed something here? Yukio! Don't do that! Emi suddenly exclaimed, even standing up from her perch over her victim to do so. It's rude to rush them. You might offend the examiners, she exclaimed, her words causing a spasm in Yamanaka's left eye and some incoherent spluttering from Chunin number 2. Naruto could only continue to smile, though more approachably on the outside, and suppressed the urge to laugh aloud again as he did so. Kurama didn't have that same restraint, snickering near hysterically from within as the situation continued to unfold. We've been in here for ages though. Yukio whined at the girl, Nanisher uttering a quiet HN in what Naruto assumed to be agreement before Emi gave in with a huff. Arg. Fine. She growled before storming across the room to stand directly in front of the mirror window beside Yukio, who'd actually taken a hasty step back at her approach. Hello? Examiner people? Could you possibly give us an indication as to whether you want us to continue or not? I'm afraid we can't think of anything else to do in here that might fall under possible exam conditions beyond leaving or further information gathering. Tur. Came a rasping groan from behind the seemingly sweet little girl. She, means, tur. The battered and immobilized form of Sakazuki managed to hiss. Naruto didn't even pause. He'd seen enough, and he was sure the examiner people had too. So, get them all out of there, Yamanaka demanded, not even bothering to watch Chunin's 1 and 2 scramble from the room to adhere to the order, dropping their near-blank clipboards uselessly to the floor as they did so. And find Inuzuka and Fujimoto while you're at it, he bellowed after the Chunin duo, breathing heavily as he turned to follow them out. The blond man's whole frame was tense with some unnamed emotion, and for a moment Naruto pondered whether pushing the proctor any further was a good idea. Dismissing the concern just as fast as it had appeared, Naruto made sure to catch Yamanaka's attention with that same gentle smile, all but guaranteed to annoy the living shit out of the other man, plastered to the visible half of his face, and he innocently prompted the other jonin before the blonde could leave again. They pass. Yamanaka spat before storming out of the room almost as fast as his subordinates had, the door closing behind him with yet another echoing slam. I think they can hear us. The sound of Emi's voice was quick to bring Naruto's attention back to the scene still playing out on the other side of the one-way window mirror. Well, maybe the bastard was wrong, and this isn't a part of the exam, Yukio suggested blithely, and that was one question answered at least. Emi's worried glance at the glaring redhead only confirmed that it had been Nanisher to first grasp what was really going on here. Now all Naruto had to do was figure out how he told the others about those initial suspicions. What if we've been wasting our precious time fucking around with your idiot friend there and missing our first Chunin exam when we could have left ages ago already? Yukio exclaimed, and it was actually a legitimate concern, Naruto conceded. If this hadn't been an exam conducted in a safe environment by qualified professionals, as he'd also been assured was the case, his team would have been stupid to hang around in the middle of enemy territory for so long without fleeing to regroup in the case of enemy reinforcements, etc. Luckily for his wayward students, however, this little setup was a test, so therefore there wasn't actually any real danger, for the genin that is. His team had proven in stark detail that the case was not the same for the multitudes of local Chunin who'd been recruited to help out with this mind game of a test. Yukio, calm down, but Emi dash. Yukio began to protest, and it appeared to be the end of little Emi's patience too. Fine. We'll wake that one up and ask him. Emi conceded with a careless gesture towards the poor bastard she'd had plastered to the far wall for over half an hour now. Naruto had to wonder if that one was the transformed Inuzuka dog or whether it was the unconscious figure tied up in the far corner who bore that honor. If his story correlates with whatever we can get out of our other friend over here, then we can agree that this scenario is just a part of the exam. If not, well, we'll just have to make up for lost time. The young girl concluded with a shrug of her slight shoulders, completely ignoring Sakazuki's flinch at the ominous ending to her statement. And hope to God Hidan-sensei doesn't kill us for missing the exam, you mean? Yukio added with a roll of his dark eyes, and Naruto felt a breathy chuckle burst through his otherwise ironclad control. Surely they weren't honestly that petrified of him, right? That too. Yukio nodded in turn, and Naruto was suddenly very sure his student had somehow understood whatever the hell it was Nanisher had just communicated, which made sense. Was that how they'd done it? How they'd managed to secretly laze right under everyone's noses like that? Naruto was already aware of Nanashi's proficiency with the language, but Yukio, possibly Emi too, had they somehow cultivated a mutual understanding of Amo at some point in the last few months? Because if they had, it was, Actually very clever of them. I am so damn proud. The enthusiastic Bijou repeated from within, and Naruto could feel himself softening at the thought, laughing quietly as he watched the odd scene continue to play out before him. They may not have been a carbon copy of his old Team 7 nearly as much as he thought they were in the beginning, but these brats were his team, his kids, now. As annoying and painful as they could be, Naruto could see what Kamizuki meant about his relationships, or rather, his previous lack of them. Hidan was just fine to be alone in his insanity, but Naruto apparently needed someone in his life. He still needed his precious people to function and do what he did best. It was a relief to realize and reassure himself that he was indeed still in some ways very much the same Naruto who lived to protect and never gave up on his promises, no matter how much he changed otherwise in recent years. You and me both, Kurama. Naruto finally murmured in agreement after a few moments of idle thought, his smile almost wistful now as he watched his students bicker amongst themselves with their only conscious captive still cowering in his seal trap on the floor behind them as they did so. You and me both. Line break. Tobirama Senju watched on through the thin one-way screen as his students were reunited with one another and sedately led out of the examination room. As expected, each of his pupils had performed admirably despite their young age, even when captured and confronted with hostile enemies from Sunagakure who had at their disposal not only superior experience and numbers, but also a more advantageous position. He could also understand Akino Yamanaka's decision to separate Hamura as the hostage in the hopes of rattling the other two. While Hiruzen was stubborn and Koharu a little headstrong, Hamura was vastly intelligent, and Tobirama didn't doubt for an instant that the boy was capable of tearing this particular exam apart if given half the chance and a big enough boost to his otherwise shaky confidence. That didn't mean Tobirama approved of the kinds of genjutsu he understood were used on the boy during his isolation. Thankfully, young Hamura had held out against any possible mental torment perpetrated during the test, as had Hiruzen and Koharu in their own way. Tobirama was especially impressed with their refusal to concede almost any information about him to the disguised Chunin questioning them, and pleased to see that what little they did give up was either innocuous enough to be harmless in the long run, or outright false information. That was why Akino ordered his subordinates to question every team on knowledge regarding their sensei and insisted every sensei be present but uninvolved in the exam. It was to cross-reference any information they did receive and better gauge how well every team performed on a more even playing field. Tobirama Sensei. Pulled from his thoughts by Hiruzen's unusually exuberant shout, Tobirama was greeted by the sight of his students filing into the little observation room through the open doorway. Noting how the still shaky Hamura immediately walked to the one-way window to peer curiously into the contents revealed within while Koharu stared mutinously at the ground, Tobirama felt a small smile twitch at his lips. We passed. We passed. Hiruzen continued to shout in his enthusiasm, a rare sight considering the boy's propensity to try and hide his emotions in the hopes of seeming more grown up to his older peers and superiors. Yes, that I can see. Tobirama chuckled lightly at the sight, the sound effectively gaining the attention of all three of his pupils before he continued, Well done. All of you. You did very well from what I witnessed today. WW witnessed? Hamura stuttered, eyes widening from behind his spectacles. So you were in H here the WH whole time? Watching? Of course. Tobirama nodded, finally starting towards the doorway as he did so, though not before glancing behind him to make sure his team was following him. Sure enough, they were. Every sensei got to witness their team's stunning or otherwise performance, and confirm or deny any information gathered as required. I see. Koharu finally murmured, still trailing along dutifully behind him. Tobirama felt a slight frown twist at his lips. They'd passed after all, despite expectations from the higher echelons of Konoha's ever-growing shinobi factions that mostly stated rather emphatically otherwise. It was something to be proud of, not morose and disappointed about. What appears to be the matter, Koharu? Tobirama asked of the girl, curious about her dull mood which was in such a contrast to Hiruzen's enthusiasm. The boy was still skipping down the hallway just a little ahead of them for goodness sake, and Hamura's quiet contemplative looks, no different to the usual for that child though. I gave in. When they started beating on Sarutobi and threatening Nidokado, I told them about you sensei and I. You did well, Koharu. Tobirama gently interrupted the girl, pausing in his trek to look her dead in the eye as he spoke. What little you did give away was inconsequential information, but enough to stop your assailants for a while. Long enough to theoretically escape or await backup even. That's what matters here, Koharu. You helped your teammates survive a trying event and protected any deeper secrets, personal or otherwise, as required by the mission. But Tobirama-sen's, you passed, didn't you? He asked of the girl, watching her carefully consider his words. Yes. Koharu eventually conceded after a long moment of stubborn silence. So what are you so worried about? Tobarama smiled at her, noting the slight sag in her previously tense shoulders before Koharu finally returned his attempt at a comforting expression with a warm grin of her own. Good. Turning away from the more confident Koharu now that she'd been reassured that she hadn't made a mistake, Tobarama briefly inspected Hamura's response, only to note the boy appeared more thoughtful than anything. He'd likely taken on board the message Tobarama had been trying to communicate to Koharu and twisted it 7 or 8 different ways by now, forever looking for an alternative motive or meaning. Sometimes Tobarama really had to wonder at that boy and how such a smart young man had such issues recognizing his own genius enough to use it without his usual compunctions. Maybe Tobarama could start working on Hamura's sense of self-assurance after the exams were over? It was food for thought. Student 2 out of 3 checked on and as ready for the next stage as he would be, Tobarama turned his attention forwards to find his third and final student standing further ahead, stock still by the mouth of the hallway. Hiruzen appeared to be staring out into what appeared to be the main gathering area for the other teams and their sensei alike, never once moving a muscle. This Tobarama found almost as odd to see as the boy's previous enthusiasm. What could possibly be on his mind? Wandering up behind the Sarutobi heir with Hamura and Koharu still following after him, Tobarama rested a gentle hand on Hiruzen's slight shoulder. Hiruzen? What are you doing? There was no response, however. Hiruzen? Hiruzen! Are you even paying attention? The white-haired man tried again to seemingly no avail. Seeing that Hiruzen apparently wasn't liable to show any outward sign of hearing him anytime soon, Tobarama instead turned his attention towards the milling crowds in an attempt to pinpoint whatever it was that had stolen his students' attention so completely. Scanning the various faces, some familiar while many were not, Tobarama wouldn't say he saw anything overly suspicious. At least, not until, Hiruzen grunted, startling as if only having just noticed his own team's presence again. Tobarama could feel the boy physically jump via the loose grip he still had on Hiruzen's shoulder, his attention firmly stolen from one foreign team in particular to focus firmly on his third and final student instead. What's wrong? Tobarama asked bluntly of the boy. What? It's nothing. Hiruzen protested, very clearly bothered by something anyway. I was just checking out the competition. Sorry, sensei. He added in a more contrite tone, and it was this reasoning Tobarama was much more willing to believe, even if he still felt like the Sarutobi heir was holding something back. Maybe, I see. Tobarama murmured, watching keenly as the tension slid off of Hiruzen's shoulders like water, because he really didn't see. Or at least, Tobarama couldn't see it, whatever it was, yet. First the incident with Hamura this morning and now this? It appeared his young genin team was trying to hide something from him. But what? Alright. Akino Yamanaka's familiar voice suddenly rose up over the previous din of chatter. All teams who passed, and you know who you are, follow me to the location of your second exam. The rest of you, better luck next time. Now get out. And so without further ado, Tobarama gave Hiruzen's shoulder a final squeeze. A nod to Hamura and a smile for Koharu, and his team was off again for the next exam. This one would unfortunately be a far greater hazard to their health than the first, however. Surely they'd all be fine though, no matter what it was that was bothering the kids so much today. Tobarama had trained them all to the best of his and their abilities after all, to the point that they'd been hailed as little prodigies. See? There was nothing to worry about. Have to wonder at Akino's mood though. He wasn't so short when I last talked to him. Tobarama overheard a Leaf Jonin tell his Chunin companion as they passed, both of them heading towards the exit after apparently having seen their team, or teams, off already. Yeah, the unnamed Chunin agreed with a nod of his head. I heard some foreign team went completely off the rails or something. They had to take Fujimoto-san and that Kuro Inuzuka guy straight to ICU, or Soren told me. Wow. Who'd have thought it? Did the team get disqualified or what? The Jonin asked in reply, obviously intrigued by this newest piece of gossip. Not that Tobarama could say much of anything about such behaviors considering he himself was right now following the pair out of the examination building for the express purpose of hearing more. He was all but immersed in that single piece of gossip. Because really, the near entirety of Tobarama's genin started going on the fritz the first day of the Chunin exams, and it was beyond simple nervousness, of this he was now sure, and then suddenly another team managed to injure their supervising examiners to the point of intensive care during what was commonly considered the safest of the exams, because coincidences like that didn't really exist and Tobarama didn't like the conclusions he was drawing right now. Nah. Was the Chunin's denial which brought Tobarama out of his musings and back to the present situation, They completed exam requirements, and didn't actually outright kill any of the examiners, so the higher-ups were forced to let them through or something. It's all legal bullshit probably. Do you know which team it was? Were they from Mist, do you know? Tobirama finally interjected, startling the pair with his sudden interruption. The reaction was immediate. Both the Chunin and Jonin just about jumped out of their skins, both of them spinning around at top speed to face Tobirama with shock-slackened expressions. Sir, the Genin team. Were they from the Hidden Mist? Tobirama repeated. I don't really know. Senju-sama, was the Jonin's hesitant reply. But you know the extent to which they foiled the exam? Tobirama inquired of them both with an eyebrow raised in question, his expression no doubt effectively communicating his skepticism. He was one of their observers, the Chunin cut in. He told me that the Genin all escaped and went ape shit on Sakazuki's team. That is to say, one of them used Fuinjutsu, and I think there was something about the one they separated being immune to Genjutsu, or something. I don't know much else about it, sir, I see. And this has ruffled Akino's feathers, no doubt. It wasn't a question but a statement instead. Definitely. Very well. I'll leave you to it then. Tobirama nodded sagely at the pair, already stepping around the Jonin to continue on his path towards the main exit. Just try not to gossip so loudly when there are still so many foreigners around to hear you. We wouldn't want anything important to slip now, would we? The white-haired Senju called over his shoulder. Certainly not, Senju-sama. And no, sir, were the convoluted replies he received. He didn't turn around or otherwise acknowledge these assurances. Those men were ninja after all. They'd be tittering to each other like gossipy old ladies again in no time, despite the warning. Instead, Tobirama turned his full attention to the information he had just learned, to the suspicions he'd already drawn from previous observations, and that niggling feeling in his gut that kept telling him that something wasn't right here. Chapter 15. If he'd had even an inkling as to how stressful this job was going to be, Hashirama Senju knew, without a doubt, he would have, quite happily, told popular opinion to shove it where the sun didn't shine and made Madara be the goddamned Hokage. Because if there's one thing the decidedly powerful shinobi hadn't signed up for upon founding his beloved village all those years ago, it was mother-freaking politics. Don't get him wrong. Hashirama wasn't talking about the usual inter-clan squabbles or even the Senju clan's long-standing bloodbath of a feud with the Uchiha, both of which still manifested in the form of endless prejudice and other common daily headaches that he still had to deal with. No, Hashirama was instead rather dejectedly referring to international politics and the shifts that very same politicking had undergone in the decade and a half since Konohagakure no Sato was first established. Of course, Hashirama couldn't possibly have known that his and Madara's dream would spawn a multitude of other shinobi villages and with them, a rise in conflicting national and international agendas. Couldn't have ever even dreamed that keeping a clan of 50 or so able-bodied shinobi alive through a centuries-old blood war was nothing compared to making sure a mixed shinobi and civilian population of several thousand thrived, even in the face of clashing foreign sentiments and petty internal grudges. Indeed, Hashirama could now easily acknowledge that he hadn't had a damn clue in the beginning as to the exact details his goal for peace entailed, or how one little idea could change the very power structure of nations, for better or for the worst. Hashirama still wasn't too sure which end of the spectrum the new supposed world order fell under, because while children no longer fought and died in a bloody pointless war anymore, they were still trained to be killers. Instead of daimyos and their feudal warlords using shinobi and samurai to fight their petty squabbles as violent battles for them, there were entire near-autonomous hidden villages of varying sizes and strengths sprinkled across the elemental nations, all of them large organized military groups of ninja soldiers and assassins who hired themselves out to the masses to fight each other with kunai and chakra as mercenaries. And Hashirama doubted he'd be able to change any of that now, despite his intentions upon founding the first of those villages with his rival and friend, Madara Uchiha. It seemed the chronic violence, or at least the threat of it, was far too ingrained in their cultures now. At the end of the day, it just so turned out that all any of them could be was shinobi, and there was no altering or sugarcoating that fact. Indeed, that's why, brother, you need to take this seriously. Tobirama insisted yet again, effectively breaking Hashirama from his troubled grumblings and trailing inner thoughts. For a moment Hashirama's steps floundered, his gaze snapping over to his only surviving sibling whilst his tired mind scrambled to fill in the blanks. He recalled where they had been going and why, but for the life of him, what had they been talking about again? I know this could very easily be nothing, but I'm almost positive it isn't. Tobirama blathered on in his usual lecturing tones. First there was last night's incident. And now this? It can't be a coincidence, the youngest surviving sibling continued on, an even deeper frown than before now marring his taciturn expression, and suddenly Hashirama had his epiphany. Oh. Right. I sort of remember now. But, what are you talking about? Hashirama asked of his brother with a wide smile, internally snickering when Tobirama's crimson-hued gaze only narrowed and his jaw clenched. Damn, but it felt downright cathartic to mess with his oh-so-serious younger sibling again after all this time. I am being very serious right now, the Hokage tried to insist in his best stern tone of voice, to which Tobirama only scoffed. Plotting to track down Madara just so you can make him be the next Hokage in some misplaced quest for retribution and karmic justice makes no sense and is in no way constructive or productive. Tobirama deadpanned and Hashirama had another sudden insight. Had he really been speaking his thoughts aloud again? Drat, that was actually turning into a really bad habit. It probably wasn't the best quality for a Kage to have either now that he thought about it too, what with all of his free access to classified information and such. And that's another thing to worry about. Later though, definitely something to worry about later. No, trust me, it's very helpful. The first Hokage tried to assure his beloved younger brother. It keeps me sane, he insisted. And just to be sure, he sent Tobirama another blinding smile to hide how shattered he honestly felt right now. He was, after all, only half joking this time. Hashirama, okay, so it's probably only like 2/5 sane by now, be you, Hashirama? Tobirama hissed at him in agitation. The elder Senju saw the minute flinch that followed the exclamation and knew all too well what Tobirama expected of him. The usual quasi-depressed gag whereupon Hashirama would turn from his brother and crouch somewhere nearby to sulk for a few moments. And on any other day, Hashirama would happily comply with the silent expectation, just as he had for years since his early childhood when such acts of frivolous silliness would coax a rare smile from one of his younger siblings and not only the deadpan resignation Tobirama had been mustering since he was 6. Any other day, such a break from the seriousness of his life, once as clan head and now as the so-called Hokage, would have been welcome. Today was not that day. Oh, come on! Do you know what I've had to deal with in the last few weeks? Do you? Hashirama demanded of his brother, his desperation, exhaustion and sheer exasperation suddenly mirrored in both his tone of voice and the imploring expression plastered all over his tanned face. Toby, these stupid exams have eaten up whatever spare time I can scrounge up like a starving Akimichi at a free buffet. You're being overdramatic again. Toby deadpanned again, outright scowling now, though Hashirama still noticed the well-hidden surprise lingering just under the surface of Tobirama's mask. It was rare Hashirama forewent his normal playful antics after all. Even in the heat of battle, he was prone to pulling his usual shit despite warnings from comrades to be serious. That scowl's definitely a recent addition though. Whether the source of that last reaction was the altered nature of Hashirama's lackadaisical manner or his use of that dreaded nickname though, well, the answer would forever remain unclear. Yesterday, I had to officiate the final terms with the other participating villages, confirm candidates, authorize any last-minute reorganizations for the actual exams themselves and deal with the fallout from 6 unsanctioned fights. 6. Between a bunch of foreign genin teams and another 2 of our own. Then, just before I would have blessedly gone home for the day, I started getting complaints about the absolute demolishment of 4 public training grounds which I also just had to deal with. Hashirama ruthlessly listed his plights, and he wasn't even close to finished yet. After that, I was hunted down in the wee hours of this morning and forced to finish going through the build-up of my usual load of paperwork by that thing you call a secretary, only for IT to occur soon after I got there. And now, today, Ike is gone completely MIA, so I have to find a last-minute replacement proctor for her too. I haven't slept in nearly 47 hours and I sure as hell haven't seen my wife in that time either. That means the next time I do actually get to see my lovely Nidhogg, she's going to spend our short window of time together beating my stupid ass for missing family time again. As far as I'm concerned, I have every right to spend any of the rare breaks I have between my endless bureaucratic nightmares spouting outlandish hypotheticals and planning out my eventual retirement to my every equally sadistic and unrealistic whim. What about my concerns for the exam then? Tobirama hissed in response, seemingly dismissing Hashirama's very legitimate vocalization of exhaustion via overwhelming responsibilities in favor of, yet again, revoicing his own criticisms and quibbles. You know, the same legitimate worries you seem determined to ignore, so you might instead explore your hypotheticals? Are you not going to act on what I've told you, at all? The younger man demanded. And there it is. Classic Tobirama. Completely ignores whatever I just said and pushes on because he isn't getting his way again. Great, they're Jen and Toby. Hashirama finally sighed, deflating now that the realization had finally settled, because dear baby brother wasn't about to let this go. Now that this Kirigakure infiltration conspiracy idea was stuck in his head, Tobirama was going to follow through with his wild theory until he was proved right or died trying. Hashirama's input into the matter not longer applied, or, at least, not in Tobirama's one-track mind. And here he has the gall to wonder where that Sarutobi boy gets it from. They're suspicious, Tobirama insisted yet again with a rare and rabid vitriol. How do we know the other villages haven't sent Chunin or Jonin-level shinobi in the guise of genin to cause us damage under the premise of the exams? With the way international tensions are rising, it isn't outside the realm of possibility. Our youth are the future, or so you always tell me. You can't say it isn't a viable concern to have Hashirama. And there it was. Welcome to Conspiracy Land. We have cookies and free tinfoil hats. Join us and beware. Hashirama had to try really, really hard not to burst out laughing at that last thought. He highly doubted Toby would see even a glimmer of the humor, what with the taciturn man being a raging sourpuss paranoiac and all that. You worry too much. Hashirama gently waved his brother off, internally proud that he'd managed to do so with a straight face this time. And you don't worry enough. Tobirama snapped back at him. Toby, and in an instant, his younger siblings seemed to uncoil and sag before his eyes. Eyeing Tobirama, Hashirama suddenly couldn't help but wonder if perhaps he wasn't the only one suffering some sort of sleep deprivation and exhaustion at the moment. Or maybe it was just that Tobirama needed to get laid. Who even knew with too serious little Toby anyway? Just, at least try and consider the outliers and off chances too, okay? Tobirama asked, almost tentatively, of his elder brother. Remember what father taught us. Expect the unexpected, Hashirama, or they'll catch us with our pants down. Hashirama nodded sagely, ignoring the way Tobirama's face screwed up again at the butchering of his most sacred idiom. Right. I'll keep it in mind. You know that's not how it actually goes, don't you? Tobirama said with bland disapproval, and Hashirama felt a surge of relief. A change in subject was more than welcome. Sure I do. The first Hokage said with an easy grin. Now, if you'll excuse me. He trailed off, nodding towards a clustered congregation of people situated not too far away. They had long since arrived at their destination, after all. This movement seemed to snap Tobirama out of whatever funk he was in, the younger man only an instant later turning his head to survey the open field which would soon become a battleground for the Chunin hopefuls of this year's exams. Of course, Lord Hokage. Tobirama finally acceded stonily with a formal bow, his expressions no longer as emotive whilst his posture had become suddenly stiff and uptight, and yet also somehow submissive, but then again, not. Before Hashirama could get another word in edgeways, the official Senju clan head had straightened out of the bow and taken off back towards the village with a scowl and a frown firmly replastered all over his stern features. Damn, I hate it when he does that. Hashirama muttered to himself before he too turned to scan over the previously assembled genin, albeit with a more critical eye this time. Tobirama might have been acting like the nutty uber-paranoid brat that he was, but that didn't mean Hashirama could afford to take the risk his brother was right for once in his equally far-fetched, and admittedly, plausible presumptions. Expect the unexpected. Look underneath the underneath. For nothing is as it seems. Looks like more work for me. Again. Great. Hey dash, line break. You did it. We did it. We did it. I can't believe we did. Sequestered amidst a cluster of irritated genin in the middle of some vacant paddock of grassy agricultural land, Emi was mindless to Yukio's continued singing and bouncing and screaming and chanting in next-level obnoxious excitement. With a focused mind, Emi instead took the time to further plot her analysis of their current surroundings, of both the environment and the people in it. Ache that. And I said sucks to be you, loser, and he was like, arg, and th. As far as Emi could tell, the paddock they currently stood in resided comfortably within the confines of Konoha's towering wooden and stone walls, while a relatively small parcel of land when one considered the overall territory of Konoha's walled boundaries. This paddock, bordered by random smatterings of light forestry and trailing picturesque streams, was generously sized for what it was, a good dozen acres of cleared land in general diameter or so Emi estimated, and relatively isolated from the expanses of Konoha's current village infrastructure. What 20-plus genin teams were supposed to do in the middle of an empty paddock was anyone's guess though. And believe it even. We did it. We're so awesome It was probably a testament to Emi's admittedly impressive work ethic that Yukio's persistence in behaving as such wasn't at all bothering her. At least, not in the same way it was very visibly annoying some, read, all, of the teams who were scattered about their position. An insight which, in turn, brought her speculations careening straight back to the competition. Then seeing the look on that blonde guy's face when Sensei flipped him the burr, having been unable to witness the other team's performances in the first stage of the exam, and thus get a decent read on any of them, Emmy had quietly decided to be proactive in the coming proceedings. Team Kick-Ass had been blindsided during their initial kidnapping and, while apparently an integral part of the first exam, such could not be allowed to happen again. So, once Hidan-sensei had been all but sent away for the duration of their next test like all the other Jonin instructors, and as the genin themselves had begun their trek to this paddock which would host the aforementioned next stage, Emmy had been quick to inform Nanushir and Yukio of the imminent commencement of Plan 16 via their secret silent language. It had taken a few goes for Yukio to get it, but he was improving and, after a final brief motivational shove and some grunted whispering from Nanushir, the plan was on track. "Andy, we totally deserved it. Even Sensei said so it's gotta be." Because in any other situation, it would have taken an outright miracle for Nanushir to have refrained from already commenting on Yukio's nattering postulations via his usual grunting manner, or otherwise drawing his tanto on the bragging boy. Plan 16, however, required such behavior, because, while admittedly annoying when he spoke in such an incessant manner, Yukio's babbling served a vital purpose. Because if Yukio behaved like a third-rate idiot, he would be treated like one. Even better than that, though, he would be underestimated and subsequently ignored as the liable threat he actually was. If all any of these other genin could focus on was how loud and stupid and irritating Yukio was, they were less likely to notice should the tiny and otherwise silent Nanushir decide to do something suddenly underhanded and detrimental. Less likely to keep a close eye on Emmy if she decided to wander about the rapidly forming congregations of teams, separated by nationality, with a vague, cheerful expression plastered all over her face. Because if Yukio was so obviously stupid and loud and harmless, and there by luck alone, then evidently his teammates, a mute Ranga midget and some silly little girl, well, they could be somewhat stupid and harmless too, right? Besides, they were pretty inconsequential anyway, being the only team from Yugakure. It wasn't at all the most terrifying and intimidating of places to hail from, after all, not with an abundance of participants from places like Iwa and Kuri and, of course, the host village, Konoha herself, in attendance. Against competition like that one team from hot water should have been irrelevant, right? So while Yukio continued to splutter and bluster for all within earshot to hear, and while Nanushir visibly clenched his jaw and refrained from causing the bodily harm he, by this point, so very dearly wished to visit upon something, or rather, a certain someone, Emmy, mindful of calculating eyes and dismissive sneers, plastered a vague doe-eyed look on her face and focused on what really mattered for this part of the scenario, her smile. For Hidan-sensei, over the course of his however many years, had at some point mastered seemingly every conceivable use for a smile, and over the course of their time under his tutelage, unconsciously taught Team Kick-Ass the importance of that same truly versatile expression, because even something as simple as a smile could convey a lot about a person, or, to the contrary, very little at all if that was the intention. Emmy privately suspected that, beyond his evident strength, it was Hidan's ability to hide his tenuous grasp on sanity behind a kind sort of smile that kept him out of the nut house and in his current semi-comfortable lifestyle as just another quirky shinobi. Because as unbearable and psychotic as Hidan-sensei could sometimes, often, be, he evidently knew how to pander to the masses and put on a believable show when required. He'd been given a freaking teaching position for the yuckage sake. A job that, by definition, required for him to work with children. How anyone had managed to mess up that much, so as to have given Hidan a job teaching and influencing impressionable children, was almost beyond comprehension. And believe we did it, despite the odds. We rock so ha. Glancing around, Plan 16 was well underway. No one was really looking at them anymore, not as any vital sort of competition at least. Even initial interest in them as the team rumored to have taken out their examiners in the last stage had waned in the wake of Yukio's crowing and shouting, and hadn't that been an epiphany to have in the aftermath of the first exam? Of course, between finding out they'd almost botched their chances to become Chunin, the blame for which rested largely on their sensei's overzealous training methods and the obscurity of the rules for the first stage of the exam itself, and finding out said sensei had been privy to their performance in said first exam. Well, at least for Emmy, it wasn't overly hard to pick which of their discoveries had been the more mortifying. As it stood, Emmy could only be thankful that Team Kick-Ass had been allowed to move on to the next stage at all, despite the level of unnecessary damage they had visited upon their examiners. And if their passing, even in the face of their apparent overreaction, was something to simply be thankful for and relieved about, then the fact that they'd only found out about Hidan-sensei's involvement after the fact was a godsend. Emmy didn't want to even consider the kind of mind-numbing anxiety she would have had to combat if she'd been informed beforehand of Hidan-sensei's unseen presence just beyond the see-through mirror. Inwardly shuddering at the mere thought of such a scenario, and promptly putting said waking nightmare firmly from her conscious mind, Emmy cast one last glance at Yukio, only to see him still going strong and, by this point, visibly basking in Nanashi's approximation of a fuming narrow-eyed glare, with everything pretty much in place on her teammates' parts. One last glance at the surrounding genin, the attention of whom was still firmly planted on Yukio, and largely in the form of disapproving sneers, and Emmy knew it was time to initiate the next phase of their dastardly plot. Subtly, the lone female member of Team Kick-Ass grasped the outer side of her right thigh. There, unseen under the fabric of her favorite blue dress, was a very specific 5-pointed seal, a mostly self-made seal which had been carefully drawn by Emmy herself after getting up earlier that morning. "Fuin!" she hissed under her breath, and channeling a constant minute stream of chakra into the dried ink patterning under her dress, Emmy managed to refrain from reacting otherwise when her entire circulatory system suddenly started to hum. Within the next instant, that initially rather tiny amount of pretty blue and turquoise chakra began building and shifting and expanding all over her like an invisible second skin, grasping and clawing at her being in gentle probing waves until something suddenly clicked and everything just sort of stopped. The warmth of her chakra would from then on remain absent, but for the slow trickle she continued to feed into her seal via the hand on the outer side of her upper thigh. Emmy took a deep breath in, resolutely steadying herself. Her entire body felt odd and foreign. She was physically cold, shivering and jittery and numb in the aftermath of success. Upon releasing that prior deep breath and as a shaky sigh, Emmy ignored the disturbing side effects of her technique and cautiously started to step away from the rest of her team. The technique itself had been dubbed the 5 Elements Concealing Seal, Gojyo and Pei Fuin, after both its function and the half-remembered technique she had bastardized her personalized version from. Said aforementioned base jutsu, the 5 Elements Seal, Gojyo Fuin, had been what initially spurred her interest in creating her own Fuin jutsu. Having first heard about the technique during some half-remembered spiel from Hidan-sensei, and, after a later session during which Emmy had picked her sensei's brain for everything and anything he could remember about his one-time encounter with the 5 Elements Seal, Gojyo Fuin, it had served as a basis of inspiration for the young girl. For Emmy's bastardization didn't seal an opponent's chakra like the original. Instead, Emmy's self-administered technique circulated a constant low-level stream of chakra through the user's body so as to search for something and temporarily hide that same something inside the ink of the seal for so long as chakra was channeled into the seal itself. Even after months of experimentation, Emmy wasn't sure exactly what the something was nor the reasoning behind the technique's unique side effects, primarily the strange physical sensations she was in that moment attempting to push through and ignore. As far as her theories went though, the something she currently had hidden inside her seal was some section of her mentality, the part of her that embodied her will or intent and possibly allowed for the projection of auras like killing intent. It wasn't chakra but an instinct of sorts, and in the absence of it, Emmy had been astounded to find out that her lack of something had marked effects on any chakra-sensitive individual she encountered. For, while the 5 Elements Concealing Seal, Gojyo and Pei Fuin, was in effect, Emmy was still visible and audible to those around her. However, Emmy wasn't entirely whole while using her technique, and that resulted in a skewed perception of her, particularly in more experienced shinobi. It was as though, with the absence of her something, Emmy became background noise, a feature or even a piece of furniture. To the senses of others, she was still there. She was, however, inconsequential for so long as she remained unobtrusive, a non-entity and thus a non-threat because people looked past her, not at her. There was no fight or flight, no recognition of her as a living, breathing person capable of causing harm. If even Hidan-sensei found it nearly impossible to focus on her without overt movement or speech on her part, even enough for her to sneak up on him from behind and not be lashed at in the same reflexive fit of instinct most veteran shinobi had tendencies to experience, then that made Emmy's 5 Elements Concealing Seal, Gojyo and Pei Fuin, singularly dangerous. With Yukio still blaring at full volume and Nanasher there to keep their more boisterous teammate relatively safe and on track until she returned again, Emmy, now almost entirely unnoticed for so long as she fed chakra to her seal and kept a low profile, easily disentangled herself from the somewhat large concentration of gathered genin for a more personal scan of the competition. Of course, the quick decision to publicly mingle with the pack whilst waiting for the proctor to show up had been just another facet of Plan 16. Given their actions in the previous exam, refraining from standing out too much was a non-option. Luckily, Plan 16 called for Yukio's unique skill set so as to cause confusion, dismissal, and underestimation amongst other teams. Also, The constant stream of attention on Yukio allowed for an extra layer of protection for Emi in the event her 5 elements concealing seal, Gojo and Pei-Fuan, wasn't enough to mask her movements or should the techniques slip and fail otherwise. Emi had yet to perfect the semi-original creation, so it stood to reason that her seal had some occasional glitches, eyes sliding over her in unseeing incomprehension as Emi cautiously weaved her way from group to group. Sometimes she would pause and listen in on whatever conversation or strategy she might have walked in on before moving on again. Occasionally she'd hear a whisper of the team from Hot Water and their performance during the last exam, a grumble of favoritism after 5 Konoha teams evidently making it into the second round, a complaint of hunger or fatigue, or being bored sitting around in the grass, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And would that stupid Hot Water brat shut the heck up already? Suppressing laughter which, despite the absence of her something, would without a doubt bring widespread unwanted attention to her otherwise subtle movements, the doe-eyed girl continued her mental evaluations, carefully cataloging which teams to watch out for and those who'd make for easy prey should the next test call for a fight. And he's looking at us. Emi found herself pausing in her pre-planned trek, her eyes wandering in search of the source of those words when, there, situated near a smattering of young trees in one of the more secluded gatherings of Genin, was a single trio of young teens, 2 girls and 1 boy. From Emi's unnoticed position situated somewhat behind them and a fair distance back, she could only make out that one of the girls was distinctly shorter than the other, the former of which had straight burgundy-red hair, cleanly cut at just below her achingly thin shoulders, and fierce black eyes. Her clothing was relatively simple and unassuming for a shinobi. It was her headband, upon which Emi could just barely make out the familiar symbol for Kirigakure etched into the metal, that truly caught the spying Yugakure Genin's attention. Of the semi-identified Mist Kunoichi's teammates, who were angled differently due to their positioning in relation to each other, Emi could see only a shock of short bone-white hair on the second taller girl and tufts of spiky dark blue locks sprouting from the head of the statuesque boy standing between them. Glancing back over to check on her own teammates, Emi took in the scene they painted, with Yukio still screaming something about their roundabout victory in the first exam, and Nanushir still just a few feet away, barely tolerating the behavior without resorting to bloody violence. Estimating that she still had some time before Nanushir, plan or no plan, lost any and all patience, Emi silently begged the genius redhead to hold out just that little bit longer. Hidan-sensei might have been blasé to the severity of the boys' usual death matches, often calling them sparring sessions and character building, but Emi doubted anyone sane, like, say, their examiners, would share that opinion. When Nanushir refrained from tackling Yukio and stabbing him repeatedly after a particularly insensitive comment about dumb leaf chunin, kneecaps and table legs, Emi decided she had another 10 or so minutes tops to wrap up Plan 16 and get back to her teammates. As such, she shuffled just that little bit closer to the odd trio of Miss Neen to have caught her eye and waited. He's looking at us. Again. The lone boy repeated. Who? It was the taller girl with the white hair who replied, her voice all but dripping with her curiosity. Emi, also curious, followed their line of sight. From what she could tell, all 3 Kirinin were looking over at the ridge from whence they had all come, the one that led back towards Konoha proper. Standing on that ridge were 2 distant figures, the sudden presence of whom Emi found strange, until she rationalized that the new duo of strangers must have arrived since she last inspected that particular section of the pasture. Mystery, sort of, solved. Emi turned her attention back to the mist trio just in time to catch the red-haired one's response. The one with the white hair. She snapped with no small amount of venom, referring to the blue-clad figure who still stood tall up on the ridge with his robe-wearing companion. The apparent antagonism from her teammate didn't seem to faze the pale-haired Miss Genin though, as her next question, stated rather bluntly, basically amounted to, who's he standing next to? Don't know. The boy answered this time, equally as contained as when Emi had heard him speak previously. His posture screamed passivity and submissiveness, but some part of Emi, even in the numbing absence of her something, that little voice in the back of her head, honed over months of tutelage under Hidan-sensei, screamed that this was most certainly not the case. Because Hidan-sensei himself had seemed kind of nice and harmless, in a frivolous sort of way, in the very beginning too, hadn't he? Before the training games and the scythe and the immortality and all that bottled up barely contained crazy. Before they knew Hidan, they hadn't thought much of him either. Hello there, their new sensei had grinned goofily down at them from his towering height, his entire demeanor serenely cheerful and a tad bit blasé. Sorry I'm late, but I got arrested by accident, and it took a while to clear my name. Smiles can be misleading and dangerous too. Emi viciously reminded herself. Because if smiles were disarming, then everything else could be too. They were shinobi, after all, albeit, Emi and her contemporaries were only genin and thus relatively young and weak when compared to most chunin and pretty much all jonin. Regardless, it stood to reason that assumptions based solely on perception were a stupid mistake for a shinobi of any rank and thus, more often than not, a deadly mistake just waiting to happen. Do you think he knows something? The seemingly ever-curious pale-haired girl queried, and Emi, suddenly brought back to the present, had to wonder, did who know what? What was this team even talking about in the first place? Because the other genin sure hadn't been nearly this obscure in their more banal conversations. Not even that Konoha team from the day before, Hirosomething and his friends, who had spent a good portion of time since their arrival in the paddock stalking Yukio and muttering about diversion tactics, which put them on the to-be-watched list, though they had yet to warrant imminent threat status. Just what is it about these three that draws and repulses me at the same time? Emi silently wondered. Unlikely. The boy snorted, not quite amused and only a touch dismissive. His slouched shoulders retained their previous posture, conflicting with his confident reply. Misleading, dangerous. The fake weak demeanor is that boy's version of a smile. Emi decided, now firmly resolving to keep some distance from this particular team, and make sure Yukio and Nanushir heeded the treat too. She really didn't like the feel of these guys. If you're sure. The taller girl replied, acceding easily to the blue-haired boy's apparently superior judgment, though her tone had taken a slightly different, unmentionable, tone from before. The boy's shoulders suddenly stiffened in response, his stance shifting, allowing Emi but a glimpse of heavy-lidded golden eyes and a smattering of freckles scattered across his cheeks. When the pale-haired girl refrained from moving or speaking again, however, the boy slowly relaxed and returned to his previous submissive position, subsequently blocking his face from Emi's limited view once again. What about you? Did you check the plan over again with Sensei? The shortest of the trio, the redhead, spoke up with that same barely disguised vitriol and disdain for her comrades, and just about everything else around her. I'm almost positive we've got the right ones this time. The boy assured her, they fit the description almost perfectly. As far as we know, you mean? The red-haired girl said almost accusingly, her dark eyes narrowed on the blue-haired boy beside her. It isn't much detail to go on. The taller Kunoichi acknowledged softly, almost as though speaking to herself, her willowy figure unmoving from her prior position. Seriously, what are they talking about? Emi thought, a puzzled frown breaking through to her exterior expression just as, "Shh!" The lone boy suddenly hissed at his teammates, thus prompting Emi to finally tear her gaze away from the strange Kiri team's now halted conversation. It's starting. Hey Dash! Emi cautiously backed away from the trio, right hand set to continue channeling the required chakra into her 5 elements concealing Seal, Gojio and Peifuin, until she made it closer to where her own teammates were still loitering. With a glance back at the ridge, where one of the previous figures had at some point left, it appeared the remaining figure had something to say. The next stage of the exam was finally about to begin. Thoughts of the mysterious Mist Trio, Hero Whatever and his ragtag groupies, even the ominous feeling Emi had gotten from Hidan Sensei's last passing words of encouragement before he'd been told to leave them for this next test and return to the village. All of it took a back seat for the time being, because they weren't a priority right now. No, what Emi really had to focus on instead was the exam and, more importantly, her teammates. Not conspiracy theories or mounting expectations or even any of her own lingering insecurities in regards to all of the above. Given the open area and the fact that each of the teams had been allowed ample opportunity to mingle and size each other up, the next exam would likely be in some way combative or directly confrontational in nature. And that meant that, while potentially underestimated, at least initially, by some teams after the efforts of Plan 16, Team Kick-Ass couldn't afford to let up their game. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, their sensei had grinned goofily down at them from his towering height, his entire demeanor serenely cheerful and a tad bit blasé. Got it? He told them, a hint of cringe-inducing steel finally entering his tone of voice, though his pleasant expression never once faltered from under that conical hat of his. And before any of them had time to panic or appropriately question such a command, their sensei had taken his leave again and Team Kick-Ass came to a near silent, blinking, shuffling, twitching, stretching, sniffling, agreement. Plan 16 it is. Don't do anything Hidan wouldn't do. That was quite the guideline to follow.